This episode of Survey Program Podcast contains some explicit language and references to alcoholism and neglectful parenting. Music by Highwell. Well, welcome to Survey Program Podcast. This is episode 3. If you're just tuning in on the 20th and you're like, episode 1 said episode 2 would be on the 20th, so I just fucked off for 2 weeks and came back. Well, we went weekly because I have too many episodes to do, and I don't want to be still working through my initial backlog of episodes when chapter 5 comes out. I know how many chapters there are. I'm a Deltarune expert. I said, all right, forget it. I'm going to do one a week because there's just so much to talk about in this game. Gosh darn it. But we're going to open with our very first news segment this week in Deltarune adjacent news. We had the release of the remade version of the French indie RPG that kind of defined the space of like indie art RPG off. So I got off yesterday morning, and then I beat off, later in the evening. And I actually had never played off before. I didn't have a pun for that one. I'd never played off before. I was like one of the only people, I think maybe on Earth, who was like big into like indie art RPGs and had never played the game. So it was my first experience, and so unlike most of you, I was not bitching about the new music the whole time. Like, it seems like 90% of players of the original game have been. But the reason why it's relevant here is not only is Off a huge influence on Undertale and Deltarune, but also the new soundtrack is by Toby Fox. And, you know, with contributions from a number of other artists, including friend of the show, James Roach. But I dug the new soundtrack so much. I'm not familiar with the old soundtrack, so I don't get to be let down. But I know Toby himself expressed some reticence about stepping in to replace a soundtrack that was so influential on him. And I think, isn't that such a strange thing to kind of like retroactively be inserted into one of your influences? I can maybe relate to that a little bit in a strange way. But I don't know, it's so weird and interesting to have that sort of like strange temporal experience of like, now a lot of people's first time playing a game that influenced Toby a lot is going to have his music. Isn't that kind of weird and interesting?
It is. Didn't he also get to do that with some Super Nintendo RPG? He did a remix of a song named Megalomania that got into the main game or something.
Oh, it's from Live Alive. Yeah, it's from Live Alive. Yeah. I think he did get to do that. And that's, I don't know, it's kind of a crazy thing because he's also, you know, he's got a track in Smash Brothers and he's composed for Pokemon too. And so he's like just checking off all these, like being involved in all these things that influenced him. It's a cool thing to see, and also kind of probably weird and intimidating to experience. Have you played off? Have you beat off?
I have not played off. I might go get off right after we're done on this call.
I really recommend it. It's a pretty short game. It's not very long at all. And I dig it a lot. We are going to do an episode in the future, probably about next month. Going to have Neptune on, who's been a fan for, you know, since it came out, basically. And so we're going to talk about my experience as a new player versus his experience as an old player, and our thoughts on the remake. So look forward to that. It's going to be our first non-Deltarune focused episode. Also, as a serious journalistic endeavor, which we are here, we do have to have a corrections department from our editorial team. And so I do want to point out, Luna in our Discord did point out that I did make an error in our last episode where I was talking about the shadow crystals, and I said that Spampton already had one, and that could have been part of what precipitated his descent, but he actually didn't. He found it in the Neo body when we uploaded him to it. So Sham said, well, what do we have here? We've managed to find another shadow crystal. The salesman had found the crystal in the old machine. I wonder if perhaps long ago that old machine was very important to someone, a certain Lightner perhaps, or maybe it's just a hunch. And so the shadow crystal was actually in the Neo body, and this is interesting because it seems to imply some relationship between the shadow crystal and Metaton, or the ghost that would be Metaton. And that's really interesting because I think it complicates even more the question of what the fuck are the shadow crystals? Are they being deliberately scattered by one person, or are they a result of multiple factors? So, good catch by Luna. I did want to correct myself there. I think it's an interesting wrinkle in the story. We now have to pivot towards the main subject of this episode, which is middle-aged women. And as something of an expert in middle-aged women myself, I was really looking forward to making our first sort of character-focused episode, sort of a two halves of the coin episode, where we're going to talk about the moms of Deltarune, and specifically the moms of the two main families, so Toriel, Dreemurr, and Carol, Holiday. So, these are two figures that I think are really presented as very deliberate foils to each other in the narrative, that have this connection with each other, through the fact that these families are all tangled up with each other, like all their fates are intertwined in a really interesting way, and that's like the core narrative thrust of the game. Toriel is this sort of stereotypical, like, warm, almost kind of overbearingly kind mom, and Carol is this literally cold, but also very figuratively cold and mean and distant figure. But there's actually a lot more similar between them than the contrasts would suggest. And obviously, people coming into Deltarune, they had a lot of preconceptions about Toriel because she was a major character in Undertale, the first, I guess the second major character you meet after Flowey in Undertale, and you have a lot of baggage from your understanding of Toriel in the other world to bring in. Meanwhile, Carol, not even mentioned at all in Deltarune. I don't even think she's even referenced obliquely in the same way that like Rudy, Dess, and Noelle are. I don't think she even comes up at all, right?
She is extremely obliquely alluded to in the Undertale alarm clock, when only in that Asgore says that he was there at Rudy's marriage.
But I guess theoretically we don't actually know that. Yes, that's Carol. Fuck it. I'm not going to bother being like, well, it might not be Carol, because that's dumb.
Yeah.
But yeah, no.
Yeah, they had two daughters. It's gotta be
sure. Sure, because it's not. I don't think there's anything interesting you could say from saying it's not Carol. So Carol is basically all new to us, and she doesn't even appear, in the icy flesh until chapter 4, which was much anticipated by me and I'm sure many other middle-aged women enjoyers. Carol shows up after this long time, and chapter 4 is a chapter that I think is very interested in both Carol and Toriel, and they both they sort of bookend the story, each of them. And I'm interested in, and I wanted to have you on because I'm interested sort of in your thoughts about, what you think the role of these two characters are. And we have some outline stuff here, and I'm wondering where you want to start.
Well, I actually assumed that you had me on because I'm approaching being a middle-aged woman
me
myself.
Too, buddy.
So I have this almost identity.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we're sort of, well, we're the closest to middle-aged women of all the people on the panel. So I think
I have the most thoughts on Carol. So I think maybe where we should start is the first point in the outline, which is about Toriel. About the Madonna-whore complex the fandom has around her. And because, for a fandom that has always wanted to fuck Toriel, people are very upset about her having a personal life.
It's true. There's been quite a bit of sort of discursive meandering about the final scene of chapter 4, which, depicts Sans befriending your mother. And, they're drunk, they're dancing, they're having fun. There's not actually food in the fridge, even though Toriel says there's food in the fridge. And it's like, look, it's not great. It's not great, but I think people have kind of taken the ball and run for the hills with it about this scene, right? Where they're using it to portray Toriel as like drunk and abusive. And I don't know. That's why I put the Madonna-whore complex in the outline, because she's seen as both this like sort of virginal, unimpeachable, like overbearing mother figure, or this like neglectful alcoholic. And like either of those, and those things like people often see only one or the other instead of treating her as a multifaceted character. And there's a lot of context to that from the Undertale alarm clock and from Undertale and the baggage that we take with that from Toriel. But before we get into that, I do want to say, like, there's so few statements about Toby Fox just saying a fact about the story that I do want to draw attention to during the Chapter 1 charity live stream ahead of the release of Chapter 2 that they did with Fangamer, where Toby was talking with text-to-speech. He says, you might be, I don't have the exact quote here, but it's something like, you might be scared because there's not a lot of stuff in your room, but your family does love you in this game. And I think that's a really interesting point for him to specifically weigh in on and say. And I think that's just something that we should use as a guiding light of, like, Chris's room isn't empty because Toriel doesn't love Chris, right? It's Chris's room is empty because they're sort of an empty person that's full of shame, and there's a lot going on in their life. And it's true that it seems like Toriel and more broadly all the adults in Hometown can't connect to or understand Chris and the problems that Chris has. But I don't think that this idea that, like, we need to call child services on Toriel is I don't think that has legs. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that there's a lot of evidence that Toriel has tried very hard with Chris. There is the book in the library, How to Raise Humans, or whatever exactly it's called, that Toriel checked out over and over again. There are all these little bits of evidence that Toriel really cares for Chris, is really trying to take care of Chris, really trying to be invested in their life. But Chris just doesn't seem to have that many interests of their own, that much desire to own things, unless it's, to scare someone.
And I don't want to get lost too much in Chris, because that's a whole other subject, but it's kind of an interesting parallel with Ralsei's empty room in the Dark World as well, which is just another parallel between Chris and Ralsei.
I just realized that Susie giving the award to Chris is the same as Susie insisting they get furniture. How
great
for
is
Ralsei.
Susie? We're just gonna do one thing an episode where we do a little aside about how great Susie is. just a quick note in case anybody forgot. But I know you recently reviewed all the Undertale alarm clock stuff about Toriel, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are about Toriel's relationship to alcohol that you got from that.
Yeah, to prepare for this episode, I spent a lot of the last several days reading about Carol and Toriel, talking to my partners about Toriel. And I hadn't known the extent to which the Toriel is an alcoholic thing came from the Undertale alarm clock, so I just went ahead and read everything in the Undertale alarm clock yesterday. And there's a running story about Toriel getting very drunk at a holiday party. And as I was reading, it became clear that Toriel doesn't usually get drunk. That's not necessarily true, but it definitely reads as someone who is not used to drinking this much alcohol. And it's also, Mettaton explicitly says that he was giving Toriel extra strong eggnog, so Toriel seems to also have not known how much she was drinking. And it seems like she's a very fun drunk, that she goes overboard, but in a very excited way, which, full disclosure, my father was an alcoholic, so he was very fun when he got drunk for a long time. So that the fact that she's a fun drunk doesn't necessarily mean she's not an alcoholic. But it definitely reads as someone who's not used to doing this. And it also got pointed out, Flowey, I said it right, tells a story about finding Toriel collapsed in the ruins. And I've heard that this was described as her passing out drunk in the ruins when she didn't have any children to care for. But it's only connected to alcohol because it reminded Flowey of this story. He explicitly says that it was because she wasn't sleeping, she wasn't eating, she wasn't taking care of herself. So she just passed out because she hadn't eaten.
It's almost a contrast between her life in the ruins and her social and her new life as a social person, in the good ending.
Exactly. It doesn't sound like she's drunk because from everything else we know about her relationship with alcohol, she's a very happy drunk.
Yeah. And I mean, that could also change with her circumstances, right? Like, I mean, there's a difference between drinking in solitude and drinking in a social context. And many people looking to contextualize their relationship with alcohol, or at least excuse it, to make that distinction. So, a lot in the game, it's not conclusive one way or another, and I certainly don't resent people for reading it that way, especially since the context of this chapter 4 scene is like these kids have just had their ass kicked, and it feels a little insensitive, like the adults having fun. But I do want to point out, it's like they don't know. Like Chris and Susie are not sharing what's wrong with the adults in their life, right? And they are keeping it a secret. Like they are keeping this from the adults in their life. And so even though the adults in their life, like they're the responsible ones, right? Like it is their job to try and connect with the children. But like, Chris is not making it easy to be connected with, right? And so it's not a simple black and white scenario, but it's a situation where nobody's fully understanding each other. And so what should be a light and fun time for Toriel has these dark connotations because of what a bad time Chris and Susie have been having, right? And so it's just not one thing exactly. But it is messy, and I think that's what really draws me to these characters. It's what really draws me to Toriel and Carol, and why I wanted to do this episode is because they're so messy and they're so grown up in a way that kids can't fully. It's like above the pay grade of kids to fully understand or empathize with, and I just love the way that that's depicted as sort of being this layer above all the problems the kids are having. And that brings me to the second point. That brings me to, we're going to flip this over to how we're treating Carol, right? And, I was thinking about this a lot with Carol because Toby's never written a villain that hasn't had some sort of redemptive aspect to them, right? Like, there's a really deep sympathetic aspect to a lot of characters. And Carol is so tricky to like think about how we're going to redeem or empathize with her. And it's not because she's explicitly or textually worse than everybody else, right? And I'm thinking here about like Undertale Asgore, right? Like Undertale Asgore, a lot of people really are totally willing to accept a redemptive and sympathetic reading of him, even though he murdered 6 children. And, like, he murdered 6 children. Because, and here's the thing, and it's because he's a fantasy figure, right? He's the mythical king, he's a mythical, like, quasi-immortal king on his throne, right? And it's like, day to day, we don't interact with mythical kings who use their magic to kill children. Like, you know what I mean? And so, like, that's not a real problem that exists in our lives. And so we find it very easy to move on from because it's like, it's fantasy, right? Like, those are the stakes in this fantasy world. And the thing about Carol is that the stakes that she's operating, like the scene that we see her in, it's all too real, right? Like, it's, we have not seen a mythical child-killing flower king, but we have all seen an overbearing, maybe classist or homophobic parent. Right? Like we've all interacted, we've all either had one of those or had our friends have one of those, and we've all had our relationships with our friends interrupted by some sort of overbearing parent. And so it's a lot trickier to sympathize with that because it's like, first off, we love Susie and she was mean to Susie. And that's inexcusable for many people, right? And and so just trying to think about like what the future of Carol is. It's like a character that's introduced like being sort of strongly either or homophobic or classist to Susie, and like, someone that Noelle is scared of, right? And someone that Noelle is terrified of coming home early, and is shown in some of the ARG stuff to be scared of her sort of finding out anything about her life. Someone who Noelle goes to the library to search things on because presumably she's being surveilled at home in some way. And then you add to that the fact that she's both apparently a landlord, because Asgore pays rent to her, and the political leadership of the town, who, appears to be sort of, a tough on crime figure, which is very sort of right-wing coded, right? Like, there's just a lot. You just add up all this stuff, and Carol is a much more, like, mundane and real villain than the kinds that we've had before. And And I'm obviously I have no problem sort of getting into her head and empathizing with her because I love that kind of character, but I'm just curious because it's a lot less soft. There's a lot less avenue here for me to understand how we're like how if the truth is that every character Toby writes is meant to have some sort of potential redemptive read. Where's the angle there? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that if there's an angle on her redemption, it's going to be about how desperately she wants to preserve things, about how she is attached to making sure her daughters are taken care of, are the best they can be. And I don't have a lot of immediate sympathy for how she goes about that, obviously. But there is that potential for a sympathetic aspect where she wants her children to thrive. She wants everything to be good and peaceful. But also, while you were saying that, I realized she is one of the Lightners who does have a little bit of that mythic aspect that others don't, because she does have that giant katana that we know she uses to attack dogs and scare them away from breaking into her house. She has this combat expertise that, as far as we know, no other characters except Undyne seem to have. She has this vague superpower thing going on, but that doesn't change the fact that in our actual interactions and our actual knowledge of her, she is very viscerally real.
Yeah. And it does fit with Hometown being comparatively mundane and real compared to the fantastical situations of Undertale. And these characters live in a society, and Carol is the society. Carol represents that society in a much stronger way than a lot of our villains before have. And there's something to be said there with how Tenna also controls employees with contracts and is sort of a shitty employer, right? Like there's, that's a little bit of a mirror there too. People talk about Queen, and we'll talk about Queen a little bit more later as a Carol contrast, but I think it's interesting that, Tenna, one of the other sort of adult in the room figures, is similar to Carol, and so is King, right? And so, there's quite a bit there of, the way that these adults mirror the bosses of the Dark Worlds as well. And I see, I noticed that, she seems like a smooth operator. She has everything in charge. She has a dictatorial grasp on Hometown, but I think you wanted to say that she might not be as in control as people think.
Yes, she obviously projects this aura of being in control. Everyone talks about her as if she is in control, but we know from exploring her vents that, like Asgore, she also has a corkboard. She doesn't actually know everything that's going on with whatever mysteries are happening. Having a corkboard with red string and pins indicates someone who is still trying to figure out what's going on. She doesn't know everything. She is trying to get to the bottom of this as well. Or the bottom of something. We can assume it's this, but...
This being December's disappearance.
Yes, this being December's disappearance, and maybe what's happening with the shelter, etc., etc., but December specifically. And I also noticed, while doing all this research, she doesn't necessarily know that there is a code in the guitar. When she takes the guitar from Susie, she looks at it, but she doesn't look into the inside, which is where I assumed the code was. Like, unless it's on the bridge. Is it called the bridge?
It's in. I think it's. Isn't it inside the little hole in the guitar? I'm revealing I don't play guitar here. I'm sure that has a technical name, like a frumpkin or something.
But yeah, her sprite is looking at the neck of the guitar as opposed to in the hole, and that could just be a limitation of her eyes being like 3
I'll admit, I read it as her
tall,
looking inside the hole,
but. Which I did at first too, but when I rewatched it just like 20 minutes ago, it might not be her looking inside.
And the voice on the phone, which I don't want to get into who the voice on the phone is. So there's two things we're not really going to touch, which is this episode we're not going to touch who is the knight, and we're not going to touch who is phone, because here's the thing. Here's what we'll say. You can't rule out Carol being either. You definitely can't rule out Carol being phone, and that's probably the strongest, even though I'm a multiphoner. There's multiple voices on the phone. What, you like multiphoner? Yeah,
I like multiphoner a lot.
But like the voice on the phone says, that the guitar is a problem. Doesn't specifically say that the guitar has the code, I don't think. And so, you know, I agree, but I agree more broadly with your stronger point that it does, you know, that she wouldn't have a conspiracy board if she knew all the facts, right? Like, and she wouldn't have hired Asgore to be a part of this investigation if she knew all the facts. And, you know, she wouldn't have hired Asgore if Asgore was cleanly responsible for December's disappearance. It's interesting, she fired him from the police force and then hired him in a more subservient role.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Which is very odd and weird. But it's like, yeah, the idea that she knows everything and she's orchestrating the whole conspiracy, and especially that she knows everything about the Dark Worlds of the Night, I don't think there's really any evidence for that at all. And I think whatever kind of collaboration is going on here is much messier. And I'm going to say it again, like I said last episode, triple truces. Like, I think it's all much messier and more factional than, you know, than belies a simple analysis.
Yeah, it's truces all the way down.
And, you know, Carol, other than this one scene where she shows up in person, right? And, you know, the whole world sort of freezes around her as she does that. She is mostly an unseen character, right? Unlike Toriel, who's a constant figure. Yep. She's, you know, she's around in every chapter. Carol is someone whose impact is seen on the town and on her family and on the characters around. And I don't know, it is interesting. You were drawing, I think you had kind of a crazy parallel to pull, which I'm very interested in hearing about. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it was mostly a one-off thought. With her being only seen through her influence, through her impact on others, I had the fleeting thought, is it a parallel to Gaster? Which it's not especially, but like Gaster, she is most, up until that scene in chapter 4, she is mostly seen through how she has affected others, how she has changed the lives of others. And a much stronger parallel is to the Knight up until the end of chapter 3, who is only seen through what they have done as opposed to immediately.
And you can't throw out a Gaster parallel here because she's one of the characters that is most strongly connected to the Shelter which, you know, plays the Gaster garbage noise telephone sound, you know, like, and which is connected to the depths in some way that we don't understand. And so, like, you know, of all the characters to have a Gaster theme, like, you know, to have a Gaster parallel, like, she's one of the stronger ones. Because, you know, like, this guy's going to get involved in the story as something at some point other than our framing device, you'd think. And so Carol having some connection to him is not completely out of the question. But also, you know, speaking of unseen characters who are mostly understood through their legacy or through their impact on others until they show up dramatically, Gerson is another parallel. You know, Gerson, another sort of authority figure from hometown who's mostly seen in absentia, this time because he's dead, not because he's busy. But, you know, and that also just fits sort of the Gerson-Gaster parallel of, you know, these are sort of figures that are mostly seen through their impact on others and through their legacy on their own family, too. Like, I guess I'm drawing a parallel between Alvin and Noelle here as people who are sort of in the shadows of their very successful parents.
Which is interesting because Gerson's letter to Alvin also makes it clear that Gerson was absent from Alvin's life, but seemingly for different reasons from Carol being absent from Noelle's life. Gerson wanted Alvin to find his own path, whereas Carol wants to control everything and make sure that Noelle is on the best path.
It's sort of smothering versus trying to free Alvin, but really taking maybe too loose of a, you know, maybe failing to connect with him, and failing to provide that guidance. You know, you're mentioning this sort of controlling impulse, and it does, you were talking about her connection with preservation, and I think this matches up with what I was talking about earlier. I mean, she's lowercase c conservative, right? Like, you know, for all of this coding, I'm not saying she's like literally a metaphor for the political right, but like she is conservative, right? She's focused on order, on, you know, on preserving things, and you use that specific framing, and I do think about how she has like literally like bronzed paper snowflakes, like these little crafts that a child would make that are intended to be memories of a moment. You know, she keeps saving them forever and preserving them on the walls, and it's I don't know, she's sort of treating Noelle as this perpetual child to be protected and preserved. And to get at a bit of sympathy with her, that's a really common grief response, right? To a parent that loses a child. And,
Yes.
and you know, she is acting out of grief. Like, she's obviously not acting she's not, like, good. She's not doing it in the greatest way, but, like, it does make sense, right? And it does,
Yes.
and there's something that you pointed out here about one of the flashbacks we saw in chapter 3 that really threw me for a loop.
Yeah. When Tenna is telling the story of the Dreemurrs and the Holidays, watching the Christmas specials together and how it faded out. Like, Dess is obviously the first one who disappears, but the next one who leaves the holiday parties between the Holidays and the Dreemurrs is Carol. She is the first one who leaves, the first one who stops going to this tradition, which is so at odds with her obvious desperation to preserve things, with her desperation to keep things as they once were. Why would she give up on that tradition when she is trying so hard to keep everything together?
And I do want you to put a pin in that, because we're gonna get into the questions later, and we're gonna get one question about the relationship between the two characters at the heart of this episode, which is very unclear. But I do want you to put a pin in that, because it does appear as though there was some falling out between Carol and Toriel that we'll get into later on. And before we get into questions, I'm trying to think about if there's, I don't know, I feel like everything I want to talk about is brought up in these questions that we got. So we did open up this episode for questions. I'm not sure I'm going to do that every time, but for this one, I thought it was fun. And you can join the Discord if you want to get your questions in the episode in the future. The link's in the description. But our first, let's shift gears back into Toriel mode. Let's go back to T rank. And get a question from I'd say just actually there's C rank and there's T rank. Anyway, I don't actually. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. The T's for Tenna.
No, there's nothing there.
I'm not cooking anything. I'm cooking ice soup with that one. That's don't forget that one. Forget that. But our first question is Wait! Is the gumball machine in the C rank room?
The gumball machine is in the
gumball
C-rank
machine
room.
where you learn something
no.
about December's disappearances in the C rank room?
Uh-oh.
Carol's theme is just called C? Am I cooking? Does my ice soup have seasoning in it?
No.
Is there... Quick inset here. I'm recording on my loud-ass balcony. I was not cooking here. The gumball machine is in the B rank room, not the C rank room.
Oh, no. There is
Am I
salt
making
in this ice
gazpacho?
soup.
All right. Okay. This is you're listening live to theories being crafted in real time that will change on Deltarune forever. Okay. Let's get back on track. I'll circle back to that in my own thoughts later. But back to Toriel. Back to the T rank room. Paravelix asks, is there anything to read into Toriel going, quote, "Oh, sinning, that reminds me. Susie, how would you like to go to service with us today, despite Alvin saying that sin doesn't exist in their religion?" And I want to point out that this is a pervasive theme with Toriel and Asriel. This happens over and over again, and I want to quote one, which is Caddy with a Y, Caddy the Elder, and by the way, fuck you, Toby, for making two characters called Caddy, that are spelled differently, because I'm doing an audio-only podcast that I'm going to have to clarify which one I'm talking about every single time I bring them up. So screw you for that, man. But this is Caddy with a Y, Caddy the Elder, the one from Undertale, said, remember that time I played Truth or Dare with Azzy? I, made him give me his first kiss. Then your mom found out he kissed someone, and, I think she basically dialed 911. I swear your family went to church every single day that week. And Asriel has clearly internalized this approach to sinning, because Alvin also says that Asriel would confess sins to him regularly. He went to Alvin for forgiveness about dropping Yoshi in the pit in Super Mario World to get a jump boost, which is, first off, adorable. But second, Alvin's very clear that sin is not a thing in the hometown religion. And so, speaking of associations with, conservatism, Toriel is extremely conservative to basically invent, to bring in Christian, to basically add Christianity to this hometown religion. She's very smothering conservative mom coded, but to have all that, that's really interesting, isn't it? That she's basically a heretic?
Yes. Yeah, she's an extremely faithful heretic. There's the book of hymns next to the couch. But she has these different beliefs, and it's very interesting. Where did she get these ideas? Why is the nicest, sweetest character in the game also the one who is all but washing her children's mouth out with soap for kissing?
And that's another situation where she's not so different from Carol after all, right? These are very, and I don't know, to think about Asriel and December sort of navigating their dual family situations as they had, whatever relationship they had. We don't really know much at all about December's relationship with her mother. We don't know much about December's relationship with Carol. We do know a lot about Asriel's relationship with Toriel. And again, it seems loving. Again, it's not problematic or anything, but it does seem like, Asriel was very good boy coded, very much trying to live within those sort of narrow lines. And maybe December's a bit of a rebel, and she's literally a weed smoking punk. And so there is some element of breaking out of that shell that was presumably involved in being entangled with December like that.
Yeah, and Asriel is such a good boy. He has that religious ska CD.
He does. He's got
which contrasts with Dess having the same religious ska CD, but it's unopened. So there's just so much religion in the Dreemurr house,
which is kind of interesting because Asgore has never expressed any of that. So that was clearly coming from Toriel's influence.
Yes,
Asgore doesn't even go.
Well, although
Asgore does talk to Alvin.
Asgore does go to church
to pray.
And he goes to light the candles for everyone too.
He's just going so he can pray to get back together with Toriel. Let's be 100% there. That's
yes, absolutely. He has a one-track mind.
He I'm not saying he's irreligious, but there's no evidence of this kind of specific religious conservatism in Asgore that Asriel has. And we did get a question in the chat that Tempest points out that the triangles on the front of Toriel's house are inverted in the Deltarune diagram. So they're pointed down, it's down, up, down instead of up, down, up, in the other ones. I have no idea if that means a single thing at all. But it is another sort of interesting just sort of thing where the iconography and the religious beliefs of Toriel don't seem to match perfectly with the society.
Yeah, if that means anything, it's definitely emphasizing that Toriel has a heretical view or is part of a different sect. The wings are also a little different, but like you, I don't really know what to draw about that.
It could just be inconsistent art, but I don't know. It's hard for me to dismiss anything as inconsistent when we're, when this is such a detail-oriented game. So, to your question about that diagram, Tempest, I don't know. That's a strange one, isn't it? There's a lot of strangeness around Toriel. And speaking of strangeness around Toriel, we got a whopper here. Luna asked in Discord, so if you lose to the knight, when you check Toriel, it says she's sleeping peacefully. But if you, quote, win against the knight, read, make it force you to lose in the cutscene. You quote, beat it, and then you get the Shadow Crystal and the Black Shard. It says it looks like she's having a nightmare. What's up with that? Also, the Toriel variable in the sword root that changes the appearances of enemies. There's something weird relating to Toriel in Chapter 3. And so for those who aren't aware, this is unused, so treat it with a grain of salt. But there's a data mining. So in that segment in the sword root, there's the black monster figure that sort of mirrors Chris's movements that you have to manipulate to get something. And that can be changed into a black deer if you change the Toriel variable to, I forget whether it's true or false, but if you flip a hidden variable called Toriel in the code, it changes from just a generic black monster to a black deer specifically. And that's a strange one. And so first off, it looks like she's having some kind of nightmare. If you fight the knight. um, but it is interesting that she has a worse time if you beat the knight than if you don't. Well, what do you make of that?
Like, going off the assumption that the knight is Dess, she's upset that you're hurting Dess, maybe, and I connect that to the Toriel variable turning the shadowy reflection into a deer. Toriel has some relationship with the knight that is maybe subconscious, maybe just unconscious. It's weird that she gets upset when her child hurts someone and not when her child is being hurt.
I mean, there's also, you could, if you're going to do sort of devil's advocate, you could say it's just you're spending more time around the knight in the fight where you're beating it, right? And so there's that potential, but it is, there's also this sort of strange, ominous fact that Tenna keeps insinuating that there would be some sort of danger to Toriel being awake to encounter the knight, right? Like that there's some reason why Toriel can't be awake for this, that something really bad would happen if she was awake. And so, is there some familiarity with, like, would Toriel recognize the knight, right? Is there not just a connection with Carol and Asriel, or is there some connection between the knight and Toriel where Toriel would recognize or be endangered, or the plot would be in danger in some way if Toriel were to see the knight? It's odd, and it's also sort of a mirror to the way that the parental controls, that Toriel used parental controls on the TV to try to shield Chris from Dess's sort of fell influence and from seeing alligators in bikinis. And so there's some tension there between Toriel and December as an influence on her children, right?
Yeah, is the sprite where the knight knights Chris, is that only there
if you beat the knight? Yeah.
Beat the knight, or so that could be what Toriel's reacting to, is Chris being brought further into the knight's influence.
That's true. She's having some kind of knightmare.
Yeah. Knightmare, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and so, exactly. I think this question hits on a big question mark, which is, maybe Toriel is actually knows more about December's disappearance, or at least would be more, was trying to shield Chris from December in some way, even prior to all of this, than we really know, And so that's a really interesting tension point that I think is interesting to poke at, and that's just another connection between Toriel and Carol. Neptune asks, what do you think the deal is with Carol's obsession with, quote, heart-shaped objects, as shown in Chapter 4 with Noelle's comments on the amount of heart pillows outside her room? And, the flavor text of those mentions that they could either be seen as hearts or human souls, depending on your point of view. Is Carol some kind of soulaboo? I think there's something to point out here that... I think there's something to point out here about, let's keep it together, that when Chris is leaving, she puts her arm on Chris's shoulder and says, as you know, you in big red text are welcome here anytime. You in suspiciously soul-colored text are welcome here anytime. And it's like, does she know about me? Does she know, does she know about me, the player? Does she know about the soul? Is she involved in whatever events put the players in, the soul into Chris? Or at least gave the player influence over Chris's soul? Does she know about soul magics or whatever? Like, does she know about the player? Is she free later? Is she interested in the player? What do you think about all this?
So... My main thought about all of this is you normally get that, as you know, you are welcome here anytime, that ambiguously refers to Chris or the soul. But if you are activating the Santas, if one of the Santas is active as you leave, she instead clearly directly addresses Chris and reminds them not to leave the Santas running, something we know they do. So when Chris is engaging in unambiguously Chris-like behavior, she directly speaks to Chris. But when Chris is just participating in the plot under the player's influence, she might be talking to the player soul, and she must have some sort of knowledge of the soul, or else that wouldn't be read. She wouldn't have those heart-shaped... Is Noelle the one who describes them as heart-shaped objects, or is that the narration?
I know that Noelle said that Chris used to run around with the heart pillows. My mom just
Right.
loves red heart-shaped objects. That's it. But I know, and Noelle says, when Chris was little, my mom just collects heart pillows for some reason. And then she, in brackets, either, quietly or thinking, which is ambiguous, and especially with Noelle. When Chris was little, they'd take one of these, then pretend to, quote, rip out their heart and chase me. And then she says out loud, my mom just loves red heart-shaped objects, which is similar to the phrasing that Spamton uses to describe the soul. And yeah, so first off, there's a lot going on there, because first off, and not to get derailed into Chris Town again, but like also implies that Chris knew about removal of souls, the ability of a human, or at least them, to remove their own soul when they were a child before our involvement, right? Which the presence of the birdcage and the bloodstain already implied that they know something about the mechanics of souls before we show up. And they were willing to sort of tease Noelle about that. And, I don't know, it does strongly suggest to me that Carol is not just obsessed with Valentine's Day hearts, but specifically with souls, and knows something about us or something about the mechanics of souls that is weird.
Yeah. Like, if we want to stretch really far and assume determination is exactly the same in Deltarune, that it's associated with human souls, that it's associated with maybe resurrecting monsters.
No way, because monsters have determination too. Because, we know
That's
a
true.
fundamental
Yep.
difference is that monsters have at least a similar amount of determination to humans in Deltarune, because
Right.
because monsters are
Right,
open
right.
fountains too. Determination seems to be associated with all Lightners, not just humans. Although, I guess it does seem like the soul that Chris has, whether that's their original soul that we have influence on, or our soul specifically, appears to have a great deal more power than anything else in the setting. Determination is not a quality that humans seem to possess that monsters don't in Deltarune, because it seems to be it seems to be about a Lightner dichotomy in Deltarune. So there's something different there, and I could point you to, I'll put in the description, the Andrew Cunningham video about the soul in Deltarune versus Undertale on that. I didn't mean to derail you there, sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. I was going to. It doesn't make as much sense anymore, but I was going to go to maybe the human soul is somehow associated with the ability to resurrect Dess. But as I was saying it, I was already seeing the holes in that Carol was already obsessed with human souls when Chris and Noelle were spending time together, which almost certainly has to be before Dess's disappearance.
That does seem to be the precipitating factor and what caused them to stop spending time with each other. And let's see, Skylar asks in chat, I find it really interesting that the final phone call in the regular route for Chapter 4 has the scary night-adjacent voice giving a threat, while the weird route has Carol call with the most normal mom dialogue imaginable that somehow comes off scarier than the other voice. Carol in general feels like the more stern but extremely similarly overbearing counterpart to especially Undertale Toriel's parenting. What do you think these games are actually trying to say about relationships to one's mother, or just the general normalized parent versus child relationship? And so before we get into that general question, I do want to talk about that weird root ending call, because the horror there is like the normativity of it, right? The fact that Carol seems to be wholly accepting of this, what we know is a really scary and abusive situation between Chris and Noelle. And, the fact that from her perspective, it just seems to be like, these kids who were always together are, finally figuring it out again. And they've finally grown up, and they're being romantic with each other. And isn't that nice? Right. And I specifically see that as, and I've totally, it's totally fine if you don't see it that way, listener, but I specifically see that as sort of like a cis heteronormative horror of like, finally these kids are, acting like they're supposed to, right? Chris, instead of being sort of weird and non-binary with it, is like finally acting like, is finally courting my daughter, right? Like, it's, and you could see that whatever way you want, but I just specifically see that as like, I specifically see the weird root as this sort of like kind of heteronormative horror. And I think that's what makes that message scarier than any of the supernatural stuff, is because it's so real that like the parents are totally, because Rudy also seems to be missing that something's wrong here. She's just Rudy also talks about how excited Noelle is to see Chris more in the weird route, and it just seems like the parents are just totally missing that something's wrong here, and that's really scary because it's so real.
Yes. I also connect that to Carol's desire to preserve things, because we have all of this evidence that Noelle and Chris used to have a relationship that at least was similar to dating, or suggested they would one day date. And so Carol being excited to see them dating, like, absolutely the cis heteronormative thing is there, and absolutely she is trying to hearken back to this time in the past when she considers things to have been better.
And to be clear, this also fits this fits regardless of your interpretation of, like, because either way, whether you think it's specifically like heteronormative horror or not, like, either way, it is like reinforcement of a normative type of relationship, right? The normative type of like nuclear romantic relationship that and all the, the fact that the sort of abuse and controlling nature is like downstream of that in the weird route. And so, I don't want to sort of foreclose on anybody's interpretation of that, but that's why it's scary, right? It's because it's reinforcing that, like, that societally normative relationship that's developing between them and all of the bad things that come with that. And, the fact that both of the adult Holiday Dreemurr marriages are a mess, right? Like, it's similarly messy. And then this dovetails with a couple other questions from Helen, which is, what's going on with the Kattenheimers? How does Mrs. Kattenheimer compare to Toriel and Carol from the little bits we know? And now that we've met Carol, how does that change your thoughts on the Chapter 2 era analysis that Queen represents Noelle's feelings about her mom? In tandem, how does that go along with the thought that Queen may reflect feelings Chris has about Toriel, specifically alcohol use? And, I think it's all just part of that rich stew of, motherhood themes in this game. And, as to the Kattenheimers, we don't know a ton about them, but they seem very sweet. Mrs. Kattenheimer, the Kattenheimer family, they seem very overbearing in a similar way to Toriel, but, they're always rooting for their kids, and, they're always really connected with each other. And I think they are sort of a silly kind of farcical comparison to the Dreemurr family. And, it's implied that Chris and Caddy with an I are, were younger, we're close when they were younger. And, they, as was Caddy with an I and Noelle, right? Like, that she was closer to them. And, it seems like maybe their family's a little more normal. And as the Holidays and the Dreemurrs have become sort of stranger, or as Milk Looker says, freak families, like that they've drifted apart because the Kattenheimers have managed to sort of maintain that normality that the others haven't. And I think that does end up moving on to the Dark World, where we talked about this a little bit earlier, where the bosses do seem to have these sort of parental vibes to our main cast. And Queen especially seems like she's trying to be a surrogate mother to Noelle, and is, both protective and controlling. She thinks she knows best for Noelle in a very similar way to Carol. And she has her glass of battery acid that's similar, that might compare with Toriel's glasses of wine, right? Like, it definitely feels like these adult figures in the Dark Worlds are sort of commentary on the ways that the adults are caring for and failing to care for the Lightners.
The Queen's maternal attitude towards Noelle is very clear, very clearly influenced by, or in conversation with, rather, with Carol's relationship with Noelle, because Queen wants to protect Noelle and wants to turn her into exactly what she wants. She wants to give her a robot face. But she has this strong attachment with protecting Noelle, which Carol, we know from the Spampton sweepstakes, Carol canceled school once because it was raining and she didn't want Noelle to get wet. There's this whole protective thing going on, and the connection between Queen and Toriel is less strong to me, but that's just personal taste. There is that whole parallel. Queen tries to connect with Chris when Queen is around Chris. She is not especially listening to Chris, but is instructing Chris on what to do. I don't have as many thoughts on this as I want to, because I only found out about universal mother theory yesterday.
Yeah, UMT, isn't that the thing that PSP games were on? Um, Helen also asked, are Carol and Asgore fucking? And I've got two other questions about the relationships between these adults. So I just want to say, first off, great question. But let's get to these other questions, and then we'll sort of lay out all the evidence for these connections here. So HT asks, is there any textual evidence for what Toriel and Carol's relationship is? I can't really think of any, but as that great YouTube video about gender mentioned, they are solid foils for one another from an archetype perspective. And I will put Deltarune and gender in the description. It's a great video essay by Stuffed Alpaca that I really love. It does mention that. And Quantum Shade asks, what do you think we can glean about her character now about what we learned about Toriel's time in college, especially in terms of her relationships to both Asgore and the Holidays? So I did pull a couple excerpts here, so I want to pull them out here and say, first off, in Church in Chapter 4, Toriel, I am grateful for your wife's, and then Rudy interrupts to say, Carol's. Toriel says, your wife's financial support to him about Asgore. And then I believe this is in Chapter 2 Hospital, I think, but or maybe even Chapter 1. I'm not sure. One of the hospital scenes, but Rudy says, Chris, even if we've grown apart, we still love your family. After all, me and Asgore were college pals, right? Oh, hey, now that Asriel's off to college, you think he's doing any crazy parties, just like me and your dad? Heh, I'm just pulling your leg. Your dad was no party animal. Your mother, on the other hand, woo. She'd always fuss about going, but once the party started, yikes, man. Once she hit me clear across the room with a key lime pie. I got smashed into the snack table and toppled everything. Tasty pie, though. Couldn't complain. And so Toriel won't even say Carol's name now, despite the fact that they used to spend time together all the time. That these four people were very close in college. And I think the main thing here, and there's also quite a bit between Asgore and Rudy in the Undertale clock radios that can inform your relationship here, which is that they were so in love. It's crazy. They were so gay for each other. And they were talking about mistletoe and it's doomed yaoi. It's crazy. It's real good. But like they were so in love, and like, you know, even in Deltarune, like Asgore keeps bringing Rudy flowers every day, and Rudy calls Asgore a real fruit. And you know, it's all they're still very gay for each other in Deltarune, and they probably would have been happier if they'd just gotten together with each other. But like there's an aura of like real adult messiness between all four of the Holiday and Dreemurr adults, right? They clearly have a long history. We don't know all the details. We don't know what combination of like college hookups or modern affairs or whatever is happening, but it's got this real vibe of like all of these really messy adults that are engaged in this stuff that's like above the understanding of kids, right? And so it's so compelling and it's so interesting, and I think you could make an argument for any combination of like weird romantic or emotional resentments and entanglements between the four of them.
Absolutely. And on the topic of how they related to each other in college, I noticed both Toriel and Carol assaulted Rudy when they were in college. Toriel threw the key lime pie, knocked him into the snack table, and the very first time Rudy met Carol, he said that she was a hot piece of work, yeah. And she slapped him so hard that he blacked out. Like, it's very easy to miss, but there is this additional parallel between the two of them and their relationship.
Yeah, and so, again, we have about their relationship is that, you know, they were all close once, and Toriel won't even say Carol's name now, for whatever reason. And so that's...
Yeah.
Everything you want to think about the relationship between Toriel and Carol textually is in those gaps, and there's a lot that you can fit in those gaps, but that's all we got right now. I hope to see more of this in the future.
And it does bring up the possibility that the reason Carol was the first to leave the Christmas events is maybe because Toriel kicked Carol out. Toriel hates Carol so much now. Maybe after Dess's disappearance, she told Carol that she wasn't welcome anymore.
As you know, you are not welcome here anytime. Yeah, no, I know Carol leaving first is so interesting to me. And you know, also Carol did fire Asgore, so could also be that aspect. That's too, true. Right? Like that could be the start of the fracture between them. It's all precipitated by Dess's disappearance, which again is basically the core mystery of the game. So like this will be elaborated on in the future, and it's fun to think about now. And that does get us to Quiet's question: was Carol like this before Dess disappeared? And the answer is we don't know. Some of Noelle's like sort of childhood blogs from, some of Noelle's like blogs from the ARG stuff imply that she's always been kind of on tenterhooks around Carol, but all we have in the text is the only change we know about in Carol's behavior is when Rudy got sick, because Rudy says this, look, Chris, can't say much, but Noelle might look like she has it all, but her mother, love her, but she's tough on her. Normally I balance it all out, but I can't do much when I'm not there, but I'm gonna get better. I have to. And so, was Carol always like this, and was it just balanced out better when Rudy was present? Or did she become like this after Dess's disappearance, and then it got even worse when Rudy got sick, right? We don't have all the cards here to be able to comment on it. We do know that Carol it's gotten worse for Noelle, right? With the dual factors of Dess's disappearance and Rudy getting sick.
Yeah, I think it's likely that Carol wasn't always like this, or at least not this bad, just because Dess clearly had enough liberty to have all those posters, to have all those interests, to try all of these violent, dangerous things, and have them in the house. So I think Carol probably was at least a little bit like this, because that's how you get a rebellious teenager like Dess appears to have been, but she also was allowing Dess the liberty to do that to some extent.
I mean, she's got weed in her room. Like, she's crazy.
She does have weed in her room.
And that brings us to our final question from Serena in the Discord. And Serena asks, who's hotter?
It's easy. It's Carol.
It's Carol, yeah. You'll find a great agreement between the two hosts here. It's Carol. Did you see that unused sprite of her with what might be blood or some sort of other stain on her face?
Oh my god.
Let's go.
Yes.
All right, yeah, we love, just we're about that life here.
Despite everything, it's still hot when a woman is mean.
Yes, it's true. It's hot when a woman's mean. And I can't wait to see more Carol in the future. So that's our episode. Thanks so much for joining me, Sophia. Sophia, you're on another podcast. Would you like to plug that?
Yes. I recently started a Star Wars Legends podcast. We have to talk about Dash Rendar. Me and my co-host, whose name varies from episode to episode, but is always the same person, are reading through all of the pre-Disney Star Wars Legends books. And we're having a lot of fun, and it comes out every other Monday.
All right, so
if you like my voice, please listen to it.
Yeah, please be sure to check it out. We do mirror the feed on the front page of groupofshrike.com. And
thank you.
Yeah,
for that.
so if you ever want to see what the latest episode is there, you can check it out. I'll put a link in the description as well. Do we have to talk about Dash Rendar? I have never read a Star Wars Legends book. I had very limited exposure to Star Wars. I didn't watch a single Star Wars thing until this year. I'd never watched or read any Star Wars thing ever. And then people kept telling me Andor was so good that I have to watch it. And so I watched Andor and I was like, fuck, they're right. Andor's good. And so I went and watched the original Star Wars movies after watching Andor. And then I watched the prequels, and those are so great when you've had an edible. That's my opinion on the Star Wars prequels. And then I played a little bit of the game with Cal Kestis, a double jump he can do. And that's the extent of my exposure to Star Wars. I watched Rogue One too, as you would do, that's, I'm like, okay, that's cool. I'll watch the sequels at some point. I'm kind of interested in the Rian Johnson one that broke the internet and made everybody hate each other forever.
It's a good one.
I've heard that's good from people I trust. So, if you're more of a Star Wars, if you want to get into the weird shit about Star Wars, please listen to that podcast. Thanks so much for coming on, Sophia, and thanks to everybody listening. I will kick it to the outro where we'll do the regular spiel. Have a good rest of your week, everybody, and I'll see you next week for an episode that's next that I don't remember which one it is.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to Survey Program Podcast. You can find every episode at gruppeshrike.net. That's GRUPPESHRIKE.net. You can also find our co-host for this episode's podcast, We Need to Talk About Dash Rendar there. You can find Survey Program wherever you get your podcasts. That's Spotify, Apple Music. I prefer Overcast, which you can just plug the RSS link in the description to. You can see the video essays we talked about in this episode in the description. And we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.
Shrike Amalgamated General Productions GmbH